Wake up.
Huh? For what?
Apple had one more thing.
One more thing? Then they already announced like 10,000 things this year? And it was all at the end of the year?
Well, look, this is kind of important. You already said you're going to do a video on it today.
Alright. So Apple had one more thing, and it seems like it was kind of an important thing. So I guess all we can do together, as a people of course, is check it out! Welcome to a wonderful Wednesday. This is Mike, and this is Mike Texted Out. And yes, I have returned to the tech news after 5,000 years. I apologize for the last minute change, but I wanted to cover the Apple event today. And with my new schedule, now that I'm doing Sundays and Wednesdays, I was like, you know what? This is a great time to test out this new schedule and see how it works. So yes, I'm going to be talking about Apple's One More Thing event, which is kind of like three more things because they announced 3 computers. So yes, if you don't know what I'm talking about, yesterday Apple had their last event, probably, hopefully, for the year to announce the Apple Silicon Macs. I believe it was WWDC this year where they first announced that they're going to be doing their own processors for computers. And they said that they're going to have their first Apple Silicon Mac by the end of the year, and it was getting kind of close to the end of the year. Like, we cutting it real close right now. I was like, Apple, where you at? And they came through. So they actually are releasing 3 computers. They went up for pre-order yesterday. They will be shipping on the 17th. That is the MacBook Air, the Mac Mini, and the 13-inch MacBook Pro. They're all going to be running Apple's new M1 chip. It's got the CPU, GPU, the I/O controller, the T2 chip. Everything is just kind of integrated into this one chip instead of being separate chips, which should make it a lot more efficient as far as battery life, and then for things like, you know, unlocking your computer or the computer waking up from sleep, just because all those are on one chip, so it's not having to communicate through buses and whatnot. So that part of it should be more efficient. They did, you know, have some performance metrics, and they compared it to PC laptop chips. Now, you know what I'm talking about. You know, when you buy a computer and it has a PC laptop chip in it, and you're like, yep, that's my PC laptop chip right there. So they compared it to PC laptop chips. No one knows what chips they're talking about. It could literally be anything. It could have compared it to like an Intel Atom. It could be like an AMD mobile chip. Nobody knows. They just put PC laptop chips up there. So now hopefully you get that joke at the beginning of the video if you didn't get it. So let's start with the MacBook Air. So the pricing is going to stay the same. It's going to be $999 for the entry level one. And it's going to come with the M1 chip. You know, it's going to be better than a PC laptop chip. The base model is going to have 8 gigs of RAM, 256 gigs of storage, but apparently it's going to have 18 hours of battery life because the chip's going to be more efficient. They claimed that the CPU performance was going to be 3 times and the GPU was going to be 5 times the performance of, you know, the previous models with the other chips in it. But we'll have to see real world how that works, because I'm sure that might be true for applications that are optimized to run on this new architecture. I'm interested to see how applications optimized for x86 run up here using Rosetta 2, which is going to be their emulation type layer for those applications. And typically whenever you're emulating something, it's going to be slower. It's not going to be as good as running it natively, even though they're claiming that the performance is still going to be better. So we'll really have to see. The cooling and battery life will definitely be better on something like the MacBook Air, and they said it's not even going to have a fan in it at all. When they first made this announcement, considering I just bought a MacBook Air this year, I was thinking, you know what, that'd be perfect for the MacBook Air, because clearly they weren't able to get what they wanted out of Intel as far as thermals and performance matching. So with them making their own chips and the fact that they make the best mobile chips right now, it kind of makes sense. They can have a machine that small with no cooling and manage to not set it on fire. I mean, they do it with the iPad Pro. So I'm really interested to see how this is going to perform, because this is going to be like the biggest test, because the MacBook Air, thermal-wise, has been the one suffering the most. And then, of course, the other thing they're updating is the MacBook Pro. That's going to be $1299 to stay in the same price, and that's going to come with the M1 processor, and the base model is going to be 8 gigs of RAM with 256 gigs of storage, replacing the Intel model that they actually didn't update this year. So if you follow the 13-inch MacBook Pro, they came out with 2 higher-end models for 2020 that had the 10th generation Intel processors, and then they left the 2 lower-end models the same, which was kind of a hint right there that they were going to probably updated with Apple Silicon. And of course, that was before it was announced and everything. They're basically replacing those 2 base models with the new Apple Silicone MacBooks. Oh, and then the MacBook Pro is supposed to be getting 20 hours of battery life. It's supposed to be 2.8 times more powerful than the previous MacBook Pro, whatever that means, PC laptop chips and all that. And then it's gonna have active cooling. So unlike the MacBook Air, this one's gonna have a fan. More on that later. And then we come to the Mac Mini, which is gonna be $699 for the base model with an M1 chip, 8 gigs of RAM, and 256 gigs of storage. And that one is also going to have active cooling. In fact, they boasted about how good the cooler is and how efficient it's going to be for this processor. And then that's supposed to have 3 times faster GPU and 6 times faster graphics than, the PC laptop / cheap lower end desktop chips. I can't remember what was in the Mac Mini. So that's basically what they announced. They're all supposed to consume less power, require less cooling, and be faster than the previous Intel counterparts. Now, here's what I found interesting. I just want to get that out of the way. If you go to configure MacBook Air, for one, or any of the computers really, any of the ones that have the M1 chip, they do not list clock speeds. And in the presentation, they all run the same M1 chip. But clearly, if you think about it, the MacBook Air doesn't have cooling, and the MacBook Pro and the Mac Mini do, which tell me that they can't be run at the same clock speed, but they don't mention clock speed at all on their website anymore. Nor do they have any processor options for any of the new computers, except for the MacBook Pro, which I'll talk about in a second. So it's kind of a good thing and a bad thing with Apple. They do control everything, and I'm sure, especially for native applications, it probably will be faster than the Intel counterparts, especially on these machines that had kind of lower end specs. But also, they're not being transparent about the differences between these chips. And obviously, they're all M1, yes, but you can't tell me that the M1 in the MacBook Air is going to run the same as M1 in the MacBook Pro or the Mac Mini, considering that those have cooling and that one doesn't. And obviously, if it didn't matter, if they didn't need the cooling, they probably wouldn't even put it in there. But the fact that they did and they mentioned it and how fast it was going to be, that tells me that they're obviously going to underclock it for the MacBook Air. But we just don't know how much. We don't know what the performance difference is, and you probably won't know until the reviewers get their hands on it to see the real world performance. But I just thought that was kind of funny. The other thing with the MacBook Pro specifically, remember how I mentioned earlier that they didn't update the base models of the 13-inch MacBook Pro, but they updated the higher end models. So if you go on the site, the higher end models are still there. They replaced the base models with the Apple Silicone, but they still kept the higher end models for the 13-inch MacBook Pro. So is this chip not capable of competing with the Core i5 that comes with the MacBook Pro as far as performance? I don't know. For some reason, they did this weird split. And then what's dumb about it is the Intel variant still showed the clock speed. So if you look at the M1, it's just M1, here you go. And then you look at the Intel variant, it's 2 gigahertz. And I'm like, what? Why don't they just put something to indicate the performance is different? Oh, and one more thing, I did notice with the base level MacBook Air, the graphics apparently aren't going to be as good, because if you look at it, the one that's $999 has a 7-core GPU, and the one that is, I believe it's 1250, that one has an 8-core GPU. And the MacBook Pro and the Mac Mini, all their models have the 8-core GPU. It's only the base level MacBook Air that has a 7-core. So who knows what they'll be in terms of real world performance, but again, it's nothing that really was kind of glossed over or not mentioned during the presentation. It's really weird how Apple's positioning this, because if you think about it, if you look at the MacBook Air versus the MacBook Pro, the main reason to buy that before is because you knew you were getting a more powerful processor, and Apple can say it's more powerful, but there's nothing on their website to indicate how much more powerful it is than a MacBook Air. There's no clock speed or anything as far as the processor or the GPU performance to say oh, it's this much better than the MacBook Air. So that's what I find weird about it. It's really making it difficult to be okay, should I buy the MacBook Air or should I buy the MacBook Pro? Yeah, but other than that, technically they all have 4 performance cores and 4 high efficiency cores. So it's 8 cores altogether. Your high efficiency cores are going to be the lower power one that's going to use when it's less intensive tasks to save power, and then you're going to have your high performance cores that are going to be, I need to edit this video. And they claim that you can edit, 8K video in DaVinci Resolve on the new MacBook Pro, and you can do 4K video on the MacBook Air now, in DaVinci Resolve. And I mean, that's cool. Like if that actually works the way that they say it, they said without dropping the frame, we'll see. But if that actually works the way that they say it, I mean, that'd be a great step up. Like it might make the MacBook Air an even more viable option. So I think as far as like the people that would buy a MacBook Air, unless they have some specific school application that's not going to work on it, I think it's a way better value. Same thing with the Mac Mini, because the Mac Mini is like an entry-level computer, and doing a few basic like mail and web browsing and all that stuff, it's probably going to be great. It's probably going to be exceptional on those computers. As far as the MacBook Pro, I don't know, because it's new hardware, new emulation for those x86 apps, and then also macOS Big Sur is dropping next week, so it's going to be a new operating system. There's just a lot of room for some very new bugs that I don't know if it will be dependable for a pro to go out and buy, especially right away. The Pro machines is interesting that they did a MacBook Pro already. I thought they would hold off on it personally, but we'll have to see what happens with it. So overall, I think there'll definitely be improvements with Apple's first-party apps and apps that are built for the new architecture. I think that things like they pointed out in the presentation, like waking your computer will be a lot faster. Touch ID is probably going to be faster because all this stuff is integrated into the processor now versus being a separate chip. And then of course, thermal and power consumption is probably going to be a lot better. Of course, the things that we don't know is, so let's say there's a Intel app or x86 app that you really need that you have to run through Rosetta. How is that going to impact its performance, and how is that going to impact the battery life of these laptops? Laptops specifically, the Mac Mini is not going to matter as much. But there's all these questions that I still have. But overall, with Apple controlling the full experience with their chips, I'm really excited to see what they can do performance-wise. And it makes sense. They do really well with their phones and their tablets. The next step would be their computers. Of course, now most of the iOS and iPad apps are going to be able to run natively on these computers as well, so that's a big bonus. The one thing you will lose out on though is if you were a dual user, you can't dual boot in the Windows anymore, at least for right now, unless they develop a version of Windows to run on these chips. So there are going to be compromises. I think it's going to be a rough transition for some people depending on the workload and the applications they use. But again, I'm really excited to see what Apple does from here. And if you're excited to see more from me, I will be back on Sunday with my normal news video. And then of course on Wednesday, I'm gonna have another super cool unboxing. So stick around and make sure to tell a friend, tell a coworker, like, share, and subscribe. And always do at least 2 things at the same time. Peace. Those chips in the beginning of the video were actually pretzels. I didn't have any chips, but on a diet. Sad.